Hello and welcome to Reportage. This is Daanish bin Nabi. In today's segment of Reportage, I am joined by Wing Commander retired Arijit Ghosh to talk about his recently released book Air Warriors, which is published by Penguin House. The book talks in detail about the legends of Indralal Roy, Mr. Subhato Mukherjee, who went on to become the first IAF chief, and how actually Indian Air Force was founded after India got independence. It also talks in detail about the heavy bombers B-24, how they were inducted in IAF. There are more such stories in this book. Let's go to the author and listen in to the story of Indian Air Force. Mr. Ghosh, for the viewers, you have started this book with the legendary Indralal Roy. Who was he? Can you talk about him a bit for the viewers?
Indralal Roy was a hero. I mean, there's just one word to describe him. He was a true hero. I mean, when you think of a hero, Indralal Roy probably had everything that you can probably think of. And such a young man, he just lived for 19 years. He died 1 month short of his 20th birthday. And in that short time, he achieved such amazing things that we still remember him more than 100 years later. And I think generations of Indian Air Force pilots have been inspired by him, although he himself was never a part of the Indian Air Force because the Indian Air Force did not exist during his lifetime.
So this is 1920s period you are talking about.
He actually got commissioned in the Royal Flying Corps, which was the Air Force, not exactly the Air Force as such, but it was a part of the Royal Army at that point of time. It was the Royal Flying Corps was a part of the Royal Army, and they operated these aircrafts. And you must remember, this is 1914 to 1918, the First World War that we are talking about.
Yes.
So if you remember, aircrafts were first flown in 1903 at Kitty Hawk by the Wright brothers. So that was the first time an aircraft flew. And from 1903 to 1914, that's just about 11 years of time. And during that time, the aircraft had, metamorphosed into a fighting machine. So flying itself was in its infancy at that point of time, and the aircrafts of the First World War were all biplanes, which means that they had two wings, and of course the Germans had triplanes as well, which had three wings. 1, 2, 3, three wings. Amazing. We can't even imagine that kind of thing in today's scenario, but that's how it was at that point of time.
So Indra Roy was associated with Royal Force, and this is First World War 1914 to 1917. He also had his nephew Subhato Mukherjee, who went on to become the first IAF chief. So who can we say was the pioneer or the founding father or the vanguard of IAF? Was it Roy or Mukherjee?
See, if you talk about military flying, fighter flying, there's no two ways about it. Indralal Roy was the first one. I mean, he, along with a number of other Indians, joined the Royal Flying Corps at that point in time in the First World War and flew for the Royal Flying Corps. Now, that was flying for a different flag. They were flying for the British flag, basically, at that point of time. So the Indian Air Force per se did not exist at that point of time. But if you talk about military fighter flying in a war, Indralal Roy was a pioneer. He and the other Indians who joined the Royal Flying Corps at that point of time, they were the pioneers.
You have also written about Subhato Mukherjee in the book. He himself was a legend, but he died some untimely death in a restaurant, that too in Japan. Kindly elaborate on this story. Who was this Subhato Mukherjee?
So basically, Subhato Mukherjee was the first Indian Air Force chief. So when he joined, we had 6 cadets who went to the Royal Flying College at Cranwell in England to learn flying in 1930. They went for a 2-year flying course. Now, out of those six cadets, five of them passed out as pilots. One was physically too short to become a pilot, so he was put in ground duties. Now, Subrata Mukherjee was one of those six, one of those initial batch of six cadets who went to England to learn flying, and uh, you know, so on commissioning after they finished the course, they came back to India and joined what was called the Royal Indian Air Force at that point of time.
This is 1933.
1932, actually. Yeah, they finished the course in 1932, came back 1933, early 1933, and joined number one squadron, which was raised in Pakistan at that point in time at a place called Rig Road. So first flight, number one flight, A flight of number one squadron, that was formed on that date. And Subrata Mukherjee was one of the five pilots who flew these antique Wapiti aircraft at that point of time. They were biplanes with a top speed of 224 kilometers per hour, miles per hour.
And he went on to become the first IAF chief also.
Yes, he was a man of many firsts, actually. He became the first Indian flight commander, commander of the A flight, Alpha Flight as it is called, and he became the first squadron commander. He became the first Indian squadron commander of number one squadron. And then he went on to become the first Indian Air Force chief as well. He was a man of, he was a true pioneer in that sense. If you look at it, he was the one who really blazed the trail for the Indian Air Force, because initially we had British pilots, we had British technicians. So he along with those five pilots who trained with him in England, they formed the basis on which the number one flight and the
So
number one
we
squadron.
can safely say that Subrata Mukherjee was the pioneer of IAF.
Yes, if you talk about Indian Air Force, yes, he was definitely the pioneer. He's known as the father of the Indian Air Force, actually.
Mr. Ghosh, there is this interesting story which I liked very much when I read your book, is about these heavy bombers B-24. And this was soon after the first Kashmir War, 1947-48, when Indian Army had no heavy bombers. But they were based in Kanpur and they had to take them to Bangalore for the flight operations. Can you elaborate on this story about what this B-24 bomber, how actually they were inducted in IAF?
The B-24s were actually called Liberators. They manufactured in the US, and the US, what was called the US Army Air Force at that point of time in the Second World War, they manufactured this aircraft in large numbers, used it in all theaters of war in the Second World War. It was used all over all over the world. So it was also used in the eastern sector, northeastern sector, which was called the CBI, the China, Burma, India sector, basically. So CBI. They were initially based in Pakistan and then flown to India through a network of small airfields. They came to Agra, and from Agra they came to Kanpur, and further down east to Hashimara, to Barakpur, Panagarh, Hashimara, all those places, and then right up to Jorhat in Assam and Shabua. So these were the main operating bases for these aircrafts. Now, from these bases in Assam, they flew missions over the Himalayas, and they hit Japanese positions in Burma.
This is World War II. This is World War II.
World War II, absolutely. This is World War II, and it played a huge role. These B-24 Liberators, they played a huge role in World War II, in this hitting of targets, Japanese targets in Myanmar and China as well. So the Americans flew them, the Royal Air Force, the British pilots also flew them. There were also some Canadian pilots who were flying them at that point of time. And these were based at those small airfields that I mentioned in the northeast, in Shabua, Jorhat, Hashimara, those kind of very small. I mean, they were grass strips at that point of time, with maybe a little bit of a paved runway, and they operated from there, and they flew over the Himalayas or at heights over 25,000 feet. So the Americans actually called this flying the hump being the Himalayas. So they flew over the Himalayas, and that's how it was. And they hit these Japanese positions, and they really helped to turn the tide of the war in Second World War in favor of the Allies.
So how were these B-24 bombers inducted in IAF?
So once the Second World War came to an end, now there was this huge inventory of these aircraft which had been used in the war. Almost more than 100 aircraft, which were, it was not economically viable to fly them back to their home countries, to say Canada or to the US or even to England. They'd obviously, they'd been damaged during the war as well, and they undertaking those kind of long transcontinental flights in those aircrafts would not have been possible and not been economically viable as well. So they were just abandoned there in India at the end of the war, and because these were handed over to the Royal Air Force, the British Air Force, at that point of time by the original manufacturers, which was the American Army Air Force, as I mentioned, US AAF at that point of time. Now the only condition that they put was that once these aircrafts were abandoned in India, they should not fall into enemy or unauthorized hands and be used against the American interest or the allied interests. So the RAF, the Royal Air Force, was given the task of disabling these aircraft, of damaging these aircrafts, so that they could never be flown again. Which is what they did at the end of the Second World War. They actually, drove lorries and trucks into the fuselage of these aircrafts, into the body of these aircrafts, smashed the cockpits, damaged the instruments, poured sand into the engines, did all of that to make sure that these aircraft would never fly again. And they were all abandoned in a field near Chakeri, which is in Kanpur, basically. So it was called an Air Force an aircraft graveyard. It was like an aircraft graveyard for abandoned aircraft in 1945 when the Allies left India and went back to their home countries. So that is how these aircraft came to be in India, and they remained like that from 1945 till 1948. They just remained like that in that abandoned aircraft graveyard in Chakeri. So after that, when India became independent and Pakistan tribesmen, so-called, they invaded Kashmir, India suddenly realized that the Indian Air Force suddenly realized that they desperately needed to bomb these advancing tribesmen so that they could be beaten back. They had almost, if you remember, they'd almost come right up to the gates of Srinagar. They had entered the entire Kashmir and they'd come up to Srinagar. And so overnight, the Indian Air Force was called in at that point of time, and there was a requirement to bomb these advancing Pakistani tribesmen. Now, the problem at that point of time was that the Indian Air Force did not have any heavy bomber. They had the Hawker Tempest, which had been used, which was a fighter bomber basically, and which had been used in the Second World War. They had a few of those aircrafts, but no heavy bombers. So actually, what happened was that for bombing missions in that 1948 operations against the Pakistani tribesmen, transport aircraft like Dakotas, which were basically cargo aircraft, they were used, and the bombs were stored in the body of the aircraft, and they were just literally pushed out of the aircraft from the side door of the aircraft. There was no aiming mechanism, and there was no, they just generally flew over a position, where they thought that these tribesmen would be located, and they just pushed those bombs from outside the side door of the Dakotas. So that is how it happened, and so when finally the 1948 that war ended, the Indian Air Force felt a desperate need to buy a heavy bomber, but the country had just become independent at that point of time, and our finances did not support an ambition like that we could go to the world markets and buy a heavy bomber. So therefore, the Indian Air Force suddenly remembered the Chakeri aircraft graveyard, graveyard, and they sent technicians, a team of technicians there to see if something could be salvaged from there by using parts from different aircrafts and making a few of those aircraft serviceable. So when they came to Kanpur, they just moved around those wrecks. Basically, they were nothing better than wrecks, and they had for 3 years they'd been lying there. There was vegetation growing over the aircraft and all of that, and but they found that they could probably make a few aircraft serviceable by using parts from different aircraft and cannibalizing the parts and making an aircraft serviceable. So that is how it happened actually.
And
And yeah, sorry.
and the story of Jimmy.
Oh yeah, that is amazing. So just to continue with what I was saying, now there was no. If you had to make these aircraft truly serviceable to fly, you had to get them to a large servicing facility, aircraft servicing facility. Now the only such servicing facility in India at that point of time was located in Bangalore, which was then called the uh, Hindustan Aircraft Company. It was not HAL at that point of time. It was called HAC, Hindustan Aircraft Company. And they had their hangars, they had their technicians, they had their servicing, benches and tools and test benches and all of that. But Kanpur had nothing of that sort. So there was no question of actually servicing these aircraft at Kanpur, undertaking the major overhaul that was needed for these aircraft to fly again. So there was this desperate need of flying these aircraft to Bangalore, where technicians of the Hindustan Aircraft Company could work on them, carry out major overhaul of the aircraft repairs, and make them flyable once again. But for that, they realized that they didn't have the wherewithal to transport the aircraft because the railways didn't have, any kind of wagons where these huge aircrafts could be loaded and brought to Bangalore. So the only option that remained was to fly these aircraft from Kanpur to Bangalore, which was almost 2,500 kilometers away. Now, the aircrafts were in such a condition that to think of flying an aircraft from Kanpur to Bangalore in that condition was almost suicidal. I mean, no sane person would actually undertake that kind of a flight. But it had to be done if the aircrafts were to be made serviceable. So what actually finally happened, to put it in a nutshell, is that there was a small team of technicians who came from Bangalore under Mr. Yalappa, who came to to Kanpur, and carried out some basic repairs to these aircrafts, some of these aircrafts which could be made serviceable in their opinion.
And there were total of 100 aircrafts. Out of those 142 flights, Jimmy, squadron leader Jimmy, takes
So
them to Bangalore.
out of those 100 aircrafts, they were able to finally, make 42 aircraft serviceable to fly again, which is amazing, and so they carried out these basic repairs, very basic repairs. It's called first line repairs in
And this is how heavy bombers were for the first time inducted in IAF, which went on for next 20 years. And they also helped in 1965 war with Pakistan.
Yeah, but these aircrafts were basically used in 65 in a maritime reconnaissance role, which is basically, flying over the seas, guarding the sea lanes, and generally, making sure that there's no enemy usage of those sea lanes. So they were not directly used to bomb Pakistani positions, because by then we already had jet bombers. Now these were propeller aircrafts. They had four propeller driven engines, Pratt and Whitney engines. But once the jet aircraft came to Indian Air Force, now these propeller aircrafts of the Second World War, they became like vintage pieces, actually speaking. Their speed was much slower compared to the jet aircraft. So they were not never really used in an offensive bombing role by the Indian Air Force. But in maritime reconnaissance, yes. Even in the liberation of Goa, they were used to drop these propaganda leaflets and all of that. And it was even used to photograph the ascent of Mount Everest, the first ascent of Mount Everest in 1953 by Tenzing and Edmund Hillary. And because these aircrafts could fly up to 29,000 feet, and Everest is around the same altitude. And they were used to take the first photographs of the peak of Everest. And that's how the world got to see what Everest looked like.
Mr. Ghosh, let's move forward because we are well shortage of time. You have also, there is this widely believed myth that IAF was never used in 1962 war with China. However, your book Air Warriors debunks this myth. Was it actually used? Was IAF used during 1962 war?
Absolutely. The IAF was extensively used in 1962, but it was not used in an offensive role. So when we say that the IAF was not used in 1962 war, it only means that it was not used to hit the advancing Chinese troops with bombs or with guns and cannons and things like that. It was never used in that role. But it was extensively used in casualty evacuation and in the stocking of and logistical stocking of supplies of the forward Indian army posts, which were like at heights of 16,000 feet and above. So you had the helicopter fleet had just been inducted at that time, and these helicopters, were probably being tested for the first time in 1962. And they actually landed at helipads which are above 16,000 feet in altitude, which is amazing because all these aircrafts were generally cleared to fly up to about 8,000, 9,000 feet only. So they were actually operating at twice the altitude that they were cleared to fly at. So it was, and of course the other aircraft, there was this aircraft called the Otter, which flew in entire, brigades of army personnel into the battlefield at Valour. And it was because there were no roads at that time. So the nearest roadhead would end at about 12 to 14 kilometers from where the army actually wanted to go. And that 14 kilometers had absolutely no roads, nothing. And it was, such terrain that 14 kilometers would take you maybe 4 days to reach. So the Air Force flew in troops and flew them out again, flew in their rations, flew out casualties when people, got injured. And that is what they did throughout the
And
war.
one of the examples you give of is the Tawang town. Indian Air Force had supplied it already, but Indian Army was asked to come back and leave the town.
Yeah. So basically, what had happened at that time was that Tawang was the roadhead in the sense that that is where the road ended, basically. So they had stocked that position around that Tawang town, and they had initially thought that this is where we would, hold the Chinese army when they advanced into India. But later on, they realized that Tawang had, it could be accessed from three sides. So the biggest thing that happened in the 62 war was that the Indian army had very small pockets of soldiers. Our outposts were like 50 soldiers, 100 soldiers in one post. Whereas the Chinese army was advancing with, 1,000 troops in one go or maybe more than that. So the numbers were huge. The number of, soldiers in the advancing Chinese army was huge. And they could very safely split up in different directions. And there could be, they could attack you from your left, from your right. They could get behind you, cut off your supply lines and all that. and then there would be another, maybe a full regiment advancing from the front and attacking you from the front as well. So this was the problem. This is the problem why the Indian army realized at that time that they cannot defend Tawang, and they had to withdraw from there. In spite of the fact that the Indian Air Force had stocked that town and the entire supplies and rations were available there.
In the book, you have also mentioned about squadron leader Jagannath, who photographed the Chinese positions behind the LAC. I think that was in the Siachen sector, Siachen sector.
It was basically in Tibet, yeah, right,
Tibet,
in the
yeah.
Tibetan
Why was
sector.
this intelligence not used?
See, that is, you know, Squadron Leader Nath had actually flown over the Tibetan plateau from 1960 onwards in different photo reconnaissance missions. He was flying a Canberra aircraft, and he would go alone. He and his navigator, they would go alone. The Canberra was a two-seater aircraft basically, and they would just fly over the Tibetan plateau, photograph positions, check on where the troop buildup was, and all those kind of things. So this was happening from 1960 onwards. And he was convinced that he had not seen a single Chinese Air Force aircraft or a Chinese airfield anywhere in Tibet at that point of time. And he was convinced that there was nothing there as far as the Air Force was concerned from the Chinese side. But when he passed on this information, when he talked about this information to the powers who were making the decisions at that point of time, they went by the intelligence of the Intelligence Bureau, the Director Intelligence Bureau, and his intelligence was that the the Chinese bombers would have the run of the skies, and because the Indian Air Force did not have a proper radar network at that point of time, it would be very difficult to defend our cities against the Chinese, bombers, long-range bombers, and they could actually hit targets as deep as Tezpur and Calcutta and even Agra. So that was the intelligence given by the Intelligence Bureau to the decision makers in Delhi. And they went by that. And Squadron Nath's intelligence of not having seen a single Chinese aircraft anywhere in Tibet was not really accepted. So the decision was that the Indian Air Force would not then be used in an offensive role, because that would serve to escalate the war to the skies. So it was only used as a defensive, option.
Mr. Ghosh, I am terribly running out of time, so I must put my last question to you. What, in your view, was the highest achievement point of IAF, and what was its lowest?
It's very difficult to pinpoint a highest achievement by the Indian Air Force, because every mission is important. Every mission, the success of every mission, whether it is a bombing mission, whether it is a flood relief mission, whether it is rescuing people from a mountainside or whatever, all these kind of missions, or after a natural calamity, floods or a tsunami and things like that, each mission has its own significance, and at that point of time, the success of each mission is absolutely critical to the overall well-being of people. So it would be difficult to point out what would be the highest achievement of the Indian Air Force. But yes, I mean, I would say that the Indian Air Force has always carried out any task which has been assigned to it, and done it to the best of its ability with a lot of professionalism. And I really cannot think of any occasion where the Indian Air Force was actually tasked to carry out a mission and failed to do so. So I really wouldn't know of a low point or a high point. If in personal terms, if I talk about a low point, it would probably be the untimely death of Marshal Subrata Mukherjee in Tokyo, because he was such a legend at that time, and his death was a huge blow to the Indian Air Force.
And that's well written in your book about his story. And I thank you for your time, for taking out time and talking to me. Let me hold your book once again for the viewers, so that they read it, buy it, get it, and understand the IAF and stories like Roy, Subrata Mukherjee, Squadron Leader Jaginath, and Jimmy, of course, B-24 bombers. Pleasure talking to you, sir. Thank you.
Same here. Same here. Thank you so much.
Please subscribe to our channel Reportage and press the bell icon to remain updated.